Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Quotidiano TV, here live today on Compass with Professor Sally Carraher from Anchorage. Sally, welcome. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much for having me.
It's such an honor to have you here today in Compass. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to introduce you, Professor Carraher. You're a professor for medical anthropology. You actually you're an applied medical anthropologist. You study health and illness experiences among the peoples of the Alaskan and Canadian North. And much of your work is community-based and multidisciplinary, bringing community members together with health providers, scientists, and policymakers to do research that leads to real world action. So the reason why, Sally, I invited you today is to talk about a book. You're the co-editor of the book Miasma to Microscopes, the Russian influenza pandemic in Hamilton. So you, together with Professor Anne Herring, published this book, I think, like 10 years ago. How do you feel today after the COVID pandemic, having written such an important paper about the pandemic more than 130 years ago?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So Dr. Herring and I did this book together. She was my PhD advisor when I was a student at McMaster University. And we did the book with students, actually. We did the book with undergraduate students, and each student researched and wrote a chapter in the book. And I remember back at that time, there had recently been, like a few years before the SARS scare across the world, there was a fear that it was going to become a huge pandemic, and it was a huge epidemic, but it didn't become a huge pandemic. And then there was knowledge around like H1N1 influenza and increasing information about that. There had been some scares recently in the news about like avian influenza and swine flu. And so I remember at the time, the students and Dr. Herring and I were thinking about things like about modern day diseases and how that affects people in terms of their anxieties and how that affects even things like stereotypes that people have about who's responsible for spreading disease. And I remember that was on all of our minds when we did this book 10 years ago. Well, a little over 10 years ago now. But now, having just lived through these first several years of a brand new, huge disease, COVID-19, sorry, that's my dog in the background there. It's in some ways made me realize that what we were seeing in the archival records from people in the 1800s, late 1800s, is exactly the same sorts of reactions that people have today. And everything from like being super scared to like not even believing that it's real and thinking that like, no, this is not
really?
actually so it was, yeah, it's been kind of weird to sort of live through a modern huge pandemic and feel all of those anxieties that we were reading about people having like, you know, over 100 years ago in the records that we had. So it's definitely been interesting. Yeah.
So please describe briefly the Russian flu for our audience. I mean, we're all very familiar with pandemics. I mean, all of us do know well what a pandemic means, but also against this background, if you could please in a few words describe the Russian pandemic, the way it is most suggestive for nowadays audience familiar with COVID pandemic.
Yeah, so the term Russian flu comes from that era. That's how it was labeled. And about 28 years later, you're going to have the big one that everyone remembers, which is the 1918 so-called Spanish influenza. So at this time, these diseases were being named after the geographic part of the world that they were thought to originate in. So this was a respiratory disease pandemic. It spread very quickly around the world. I think that's one of the things that surprised people in that generation the most, was how quickly it was spreading. And this is because, we're in the Industrial Revolution here, and there's an increasing availability of public transportation, particularly trains. And also there's increased boat traffic across the oceans and the seas to get people from continent to continent. So it spread very quickly, and that surprised and scared a lot of people. However, back then, we have to remember how people were thinking about it back then. Nobody knew it was caused by a virus. Germ theory was around, but it was kind of a newer idea, and it wasn't even totally accepted by everyone in the sciences or the medical sciences yet. There were competing theories of what causes disease, such as miasma, which is the understanding that, or the belief that dead particulate is kind of emanating and hanging out in the air and from noxious fumes. And if you breathe that bad air in, that miasma air, that you will get sick. So from the understanding of the time, people called it influenza. A lot of people called it the grippe in English, or la grippe in French, which is actually a reference to like death, the specter gripping your soul when you get sick, and then he might take you and you die. So people were thinking about this differently than medical scientists think about these types of respiratory diseases today. But it did have a huge impact. It started in 1889. The first wave lasted for several months. That's where it spread around the world. It continued in sort of these multiple waves, kind of like what we've seen recently with COVID, up through about 1894. And it's estimated to have killed about 1 million people, which is huge, especially back then. There was only about 1.5 billion people in the population. It was a much smaller world at that time.
But I think I have read in an article published by Professor Berchet, who is one of the presidents of the Pasteur, the famous Pasteur Institute in France, that the mortality rate tends to be somehow similar to, in proportions to COVID. That's what he's saying, and that he even speculates that it might have been back then also a coronavirus, the reason for the pandemic. But we'll come to this point. One thing which is quite fascinating is that, I mean, there were no computers, and nevertheless, we still have lots of statistics regarding the spread of the disease. I mean, it means like having, I don't know, dozens of like accountants, for instance, or math teachers doing all the calculations, how the disease spread around. I mean, that was a masterpiece to calculate all these figures without a computer. I mean, there was no way just to feed a computer software and to give you a diagram and to estimate the speed of the spread.
Yeah. Sorry, so what's the question there?
I mean, how did it come that they were ready for such a pandemic to have so many, let's say, accountants? I don't know who else might have been familiar with math and do all this research and investigate and explain the spread of the disease.
Yeah, so there's mathematical modeling, of course, has come a long way, especially with the aid of computers to just calculate things for us much, much faster. So I think in terms of trying to look at patterns and huge data sets, computers are, nowadays essential for that, right? But and I'm not a mathematician at all, just put that out there. But what the computers are doing is it still starts from the human mind. And so I think to answer your question there, back during when these pandemics were happening, first off, there wasn't really a lot of people being able to predict or even trying to predict precisely where it would go. It was more of just a, sort of like a general, like, we've seen it in this country, we've seen it in this country, it's spreading through these counties and these regions. You know, and we recognize the basic pattern, like, oh, like it started here and then it does geographically kind of pulsate out.
And who was
And
in
people
charge?
did
Yeah,
notice,
sorry.
people did notice at that time, just, you know, basic human powers of observation. They noticed, oh, it's these cities that are connected by major railways. Oh, it's coming through ports across the ocean and the sea. So I just think our basic human brain powers are pretty good at recognizing patterns. What the computers and advanced math can do for us today is help us take that to the next level and make things much more quick, much more fast. And again, looking at it, millions of data points at a single time. That's what the computers can help us do.
Another interesting thing is who was in charge for the awareness? I mean, it started in Turkestan, somewhere in the Asian part of Russia. There was no internet. There was no, I think there was no electricity either. Who was in charge for the awareness, or how, let's say, would have scientists in UK or Canada or USA would have got to know that something goes wrong in Russia, particularly since it resembles a flu? How did they get this information, and who was then later in charge for the awareness of the people so that people could have panicked, or at least could have not panicked, but could have protect themselves, be aware that something is happening?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So back at this time, there wasn't like the World Health Organization. There wasn't on a global level any sort of disease surveillance system or health surveillance system at all. But as far as how people were made aware, it's more like the media and newspapers were doing their jobs and they were reporting the news, and people take news with them. Back at that time, it would be a lot of word of mouth. But again, if you're traveling and you're like, oh, I read in the newspaper back home about this thing that people are scared about, and then you show up in another place and you're like, wait a minute, your newspaper is also scared about this. So it's really spread through media networks. There wasn't any sort of agency or oversight into that. It was just people putting information out and then other people saying, wait a minute, there's a lot of information coming here. Another good source of information, though, so even though there was not like a global health surveillance system at all, or organization really at all at that time, there was on a local level. And this is going to vary from country to country based on how their governments are structured and how they're socially structured. But on a local level, you would have things like in Canada, it would have been Provincial Board of Health meetings for, you know, Ontario, or, you know, Manitoba, and these different places, territorial health board records sometimes for the territories. In the United States, it would have been on a county by county and then a state by state basis. And then for Europe, it would be, you know, in each country, how they divide their regions up. And so those folks were also paying attention to the newspapers, but then they also had the access to local physicians, for example, to say, hey, what are you seeing? Can you report your cases to us? Can you report how many people died so that we can get some statistics? So it's much more sort of dispersed, and people were tracking things, but it wasn't on a super high organized level.
So it was more like spontaneously, but nevertheless, it worked well. And there was a sort of cooperation between states or governmental agents.
There was a sort of a quick realization at the levels of leadership in different countries that, like, you know, we need to talk to these people who have this information from these different centers, particularly large cities, you know. So there starts to be like a recognition that, like, oh, there's this information that's out there. We need to start collecting it and talking to people. And then from that, and then subsequent pandemics, especially 1918 pandemic, about, you know, 3 decades later, we start to see more of a coordinated approach to tracking and preparing for diseases.
May I ask you something, please, Sally? Given you would have written this book now after having made your personal experience with COVID, Would you have written this book differently, or would you have extended your research on some other topics which you might feel now that you could have ignored or neglected them? It's a more personal question.
Yeah,
We
I
always
think,
regret having done something not properly. I'm not saying you've
yeah.
written a fabulous book, but from your personal experience, would you have preferred having written this book back then 10 years ago, or would you have preferred theoretically having had the option to have written it nowadays?
I think if we were to do another, I think specifically what's interesting here is again, each student in our class wrote a different chapter, and Anne and I helped them through that research and writing process. And they were sort of free to pick their ideas, but we guided them in terms of like finalizing the ideas. And I think specifically, as far as looking at symptoms, maybe, which was one of the chapters, and then looking at possible biological information about the 1889 pandemic, those chapters would look different today because we know more. And we know about, for example, we're starting to learn more and more about coronaviruses because of COVID-19. And so I think that there's also just been basically more advances in ancient disease study just in the past few years in terms of trying to look at genetics and genomics for past diseases that were caused by pathogens. That's still sort of very limited in that you have to have a tissue sample from that era that is not contaminated that you can test. But there is sort of this flowering and this evolution of genetic science right now, which is very exciting. And I think if we redid that same project today, the biology chapters would have more information to work with, and so they probably would have come out a little bit richer.
Several neurologists and psychiatrists described the neurological complications and psychiatric problems after the Spanish flu, or maybe the other name is like Encephalitis Lethargica. Were there also, after the Russian flu, similar cases of cognitive decline or neurodegenerative disease symptoms like after the Spanish flu?
Yeah, absolutely, there were. And some people were actually noticing those patterns at that time and trying to document them. So we have an incomplete historical record, but we have some observations from the historical archives. So there's a few different things here. One that I want to point out is actually from popular culture. So it's a fictional story, but the editors swear that it's based on fact. But there was a magazine in England in the 1890s where they published the Sherlock Holmes stories. Right, so it's a fictional magazine, but they published a story in like 1895. I think it was like right sort of at the end of the pandemic, and in the story there's a physician who has a mental breakdown, and he has that mental breakdown because he's grieving because his own daughter died from the Russian influenza in 1893. So, this is fiction, but it would have spoken to a lot of people at that time because it would have been something very personal and engaging to them. It's a fictional story. The magazine does say it's based on fact, though. Now, in real life, about that same time, there's also some articles that were published in the Lancet, which is a big medical journal, as we know. And there was one physician who wrote that they were seeing several patients, or that they had several other physicians report to them that they were all seeing patients who had the influenza, who also at the same time were presenting with different psychoses. And this included things like suicidal ideation and thoughts, which that doesn't surprise me. Pandemics can be very scary, and can cause depression and anxiety, and
Also
that
violence and aggressive behavior.
yeah, that one did surprise me actually, because I didn't really understand it, but there was some notes in the Lancet of patients also having influenza and then co-presenting with what the doctor labeled as homicidal or violent tendencies. And then just generally, there's also a lot of reports of the big ones are anxiety, insomnia, and inability to sleep, fatigue, like so bad that you just can't get up and go on with your day, and then also depression. And we now know that yes, absolutely, physical diseases can have mental and emotional impacts and cause mental health crises as well, especially for people who are not supported well enough to be able to deal with their sickness at that time.
So I think, in my view, I shall say that one of the most fascinating parts of this Russian flu is the carbolic smokepool. So, yeah. Please explain us. I mean, law students who are familiar with common law would definitely know exactly what we are referring to, but please explain us what is the whole story about this ball, about the carbolic smoke ball about?
Okay, yeah. So first off, carbolic acid, which was a product that was mostly like in a dry powder form, it was first discovered to be able to like help prevent gangrene and necrosis from setting into open wounds. And that was Joseph Lister, who published on that. And that was about 30-ish, maybe 20 to 30 years before the 1889 pandemic. So people knew carbolic acid on open wounds could keep them from getting gangrene. Of course, it is an acid, and it's kind of a nasty one. It will cause skin burning and other tissue damage. So the carbolic smoke ball, it was a product that was widely marketed in the UK. And I don't think I've personally seen any advertisements for it in Canada or the United States, but that doesn't mean it wasn't there. It just means in the region I was looking at, I didn't see it. But back in the UK, I have seen ads for this. It's like a little rubber balloon almost with a tube in it, and the carbolic acid is inside. And then you take the tube and you stick it up your nose and you
inhale it.
You inhale carbolic acid into your nasal passageways, which sounds horrifying to me. And it did cause tissue damage in people. And specifically, as you mentioned, the reason that particular product is famous in England amongst lawyers is because some people sued the people who advertised it, because they had guaranteed that they actually guaranteed it as a preventative. They want people to go out, buy this product, puff it up their nose,
but where was it
and
available?
they won't get sick. And they had a guarantee in the ad that if you did this and then you got sick, that they would reimburse you like some amount of money.
Like £100, I think. But it was it was quite a lot of money these days.
Yeah.
But tell me, was this product available like worldwide or only in the UK?
I don't know how widely it was available. I do know that in the parts of Canada where Dr. Herring and I were looking at records, we didn't see it. We did see ads in newspapers, for example, for just carbolic acid in general, but not for the smoke ball. And for those ads in Ontario, where our project was, the Provincial Board of Health actually released public statements saying like, you can use carbolic acid if you want to, but like maybe put it in milk and mix it with lime water so that it doesn't like burn you and hurt you. So they were actually advocating for people to sort of dilute it by putting it in these other substances to make it a little less dangerous for people to consume.
And were there any sort of investigations? Were there like nasal swabbings? Were physicians looking for a pathogen agent which might have infected people?
No, not at this time. So this, the conventional wisdom of the time was that people knew that it was spreading. some people in the scientific community were thinking that this follows what was still new at that time, which is germ theory, that there's some tiny microscopic agent responsible for this. People didn't know if it was a bacteria. People didn't know really anything about viruses back then, but just something tiny that spreads from person to person. There was people who were worried that it was spreading in dirty water. And for example, we know that cholera, which is caused by a bacteria, does in fact spread through infected, through wastewater. But people were wondering, is this influenza coming from the bad sewage problem that we have in our city? Is it coming from the miasma, the smelly air that rises up? People were worried that miasma could come from sewage, but they were also worried it could come from places like cemeteries, like it's just kind of raising up from the dead into the air. So yeah, at that time, people were not swabbing or looking for infectious agents. I don't even think they really had a way to do that on a massive scale like you have today, where you have machines that can test.
It was quite usual during the Spanish flu, nasal swabbings, although nowadays scientists still don't understand why people had to undergo this nasal swabbing, since Encephalitis Lethargica was not spread by a bacteria, or at least not by a conventional virus. But one thing I'd like to ask you, were people aware that this carbolic smokepool might, to the contrary, rather help a certain unknown pathogen agent, and I think it's still unknown today, that the inhaling this oil might have made them vulnerable for or more susceptible to the disease?
I don't think so, because I wasn't seeing any warnings about the product making you more susceptible to getting sick. The only warnings that I have seen were warnings about basically the acid itself being pretty intense and causing some tissue damage, some pain, and some burning, but not that it would affect your body's ability to fight off other diseases.
Yeah, look, I'm not a physician, but I came across a fascinating paper written by Professor Bramwell. He was like one of the very, very famous neurologists of Great Britain. And he published 1923 a paper on Encephalitis Lethargica, since what we know today that the Russian flu somehow resembles the Spanish flu and Encephalitis Lethargica, and it resembles COVID-19. So I mean, what walks like a duck, quacks like a duck, obviously must be a duck. And physicians were in the 20s aware that this virus does not simply spread like that. It's quite an unusual virus, and Professor Edwin Bramwell made a fascinating observation. He said, thus, if I may quote, thus it would appear that the virus is located in the brain tissue, that it is also present in the cerebrospinal fluid, and that it is met with on the surface of the nasopharyngeal mucous membrane. Further, since the virus, after passage through a porcelain filter, is capable of multiplication, it would appear to be a living organism. Now, make a long story short, he says, Levaditi also affirmed that the disease can be transmitted by mucosa of the nose after the latter has been irritated by croton oil. I must admit that I never heard of croton oil. So I Googled, and I found that croton oil is a phenol oil, much like the content of the carbolic pools, the smoke pool. So 50 years later, 1923, Edwin Bramwell observed, and that's what he's writing in this paper, that, and he's also talking about mechanical lesions of the nasal mucosa, that mechanical lesions or chemical lesions increase the susceptibility to the disease. So that would mean for me that people were told, inhale and protect yourself. Well, for sure, an acid is not like a perfume, but it looks to me that people actually became rather susceptible to the disease after having irritated their nasal mucosa with this acid.
Yeah, that's a really interesting idea. I don't think you would really be able to test it though, because you would have to have information that we just don't have. There's too many holes in the historic record. But if you were to look at that, what you would want to look at is at that time, maybe like a group of people who didn't use the carbolic smoke ball, a group of people who did, right? Like a control and a dependent, independent variable. And then especially if they live in the same area, and then just track them over time and see who got sick. And then was there actually a correlation in like carbolic ball smoke ball users and an increase. Unfortunately we're unable to carry that exercise out, but it's a really interesting idea. If you were to find any evidence at all of that could suggest that from the past, and it wouldn't you wouldn't be able to confirm it statistically, but it would still be useful information if anybody wrote about that, if anybody in a diary or in a doctor's note or in any sort of observation, an advice column in the paper, anything. If people observed it at that time, you wouldn't know how many people or the percentage of the population, but you would at least know that people were aware that it could happen back then.
Another aspect which I'd like to talk to you about is, what about the prevalence of the Russian flu among different ethnic groups?
Yeah.
Were all people equal and the same, like in front of the virus, or there were certain susceptibilities or preferences?
Yeah, so all people were not affected equally by this virus, but it's not because of it's not because of genetic affinity to ancestral populations, and it's not because of cultural or ethnical differences in background. There probably is some biological component there, but not on the scale of racial groups or ethnical groups, but maybe just in terms of who's naturally more likely to get sick from something. So people who are immunocompromised, for example, that can run in families, but that doesn't describe an entire, social or racial group of people. Where we do see differences, and we see this again and again, we see it in the 1889 pandemic. We see it certainly in the 1918 pandemic. We see it in subsequent pandemics. We saw it just recently with COVID-19, where we have the worst experiences with spread, infection rate, and mortality. And also in COVID's case, severe complications from long COVID. Where we're seeing the concentrations of that is amongst groups of people who are socially, politically, and economically marginalized, and there's a lot of reasons for that. When you grow up living in a marginalized community, in a marginalized space, you're more likely than other folks to have already some health problems, maybe. So certain other co-occurring diseases or malnutrition or inadequate nutrition, which can affect the body's ability to fight off infection, right? And then there's also just basic access to healthcare, or even basic access to sanitation systems and to, just everything that makes your quality of life higher. So we do see differences in populations that are affected, but they're not along racial or ethnic lines. They're more along
there were
social
ethnic differences. So if interrupting, but during Encephalitis Lethargica, there were ethnic differences.
Yeah, but again, that has more to do with the social construction of race, and then the political effect of white supremacy through everything like neighborhood segregation, less resources, economic and political resources for people in African American communities, redlining in neighborhoods, so that very much you're affecting the physical spaces that people have to live in and what resources are available to them there. Plus, also, there is, I think, a strong argument for the health impacts of multi-generational trauma as well. And those are things that are starting to be explored in the medical sciences and in medical social sciences. But yeah, there's reasons why people from a specific ethnic group or racial group will appear to have worse outcomes. But when you actually dig into the weeds, it's things like, not that they're naturally predisposed because of who their ancestors are, but more so what's happened to their lineage and their community over these generations that has sort of piled up these barriers and led to other co-occurring challenges that people are having with their health that makes them less able to fight off an infection.
Were the consequences of the Russian flu also similar to the consequences after the Spanish flu, Encephalitis Lethargica, in terms of stigmatization? I mean, someone suffering of a degenerative disease or of a cognitive decline would certainly feel, for sure, embarrassed. It's the same like with long COVID. I mean, you'll double think, although you shouldn't, if you should or not address your physician and talk about your suffering, because you might feel ashamed or afraid that you might lose your driver's license or would have consequences at work. Was there also a similar trend of stigmatization, people who were suffering of this mental or cognitive decline?
I don't know specifically about that, but I could speak a little bit broader about stigma and pandemics. For sure, there is stigma that's sort of leveled against the scapegoats, the people who are being blamed for where a disease comes from or who are perceived as having spread it. So with 1889, there would be people of Russian descent or people of Russian descent living in other nations who have Russian sounding surnames and whatnot. With 1918, that was people of Spanish descent. And with COVID-19, of course, it was people of Asian descent, where we see stigma and we see discrimination and even outright.
So there's always a scapegoat.
Yeah, there's always a scapegoat. As far as stigma for people who have suffered from the disease personally, I don't know so much about Russian influenza. At that time, I can't really speak to that because I just don't know of any accounts of that happening.
Another aspect which I'd like now towards the end of our interview to talk to you about is, how do you think, look, the impact of the Russian flu on science? Did this worldwide pandemic somehow lead to a higher emancipation of scientists? Did scientists start to cooperate? Were they taking such issues? We had almost at the same time a similar disease in Italy, the Nana or the Nona influenza. Did this determine scientists to say, let's work together in order to combat future pandemics?
We certainly will see much more of this happening after 1918 influenza. In the late 1800s into the early 1900s, there at the sort of the tail end of this influenza, we do have people maybe starting to share more information with each other and realizing like we should be keeping records of certain things that happen and getting more coordinated and more organized with their record storage. But again, I think more so on like a regional to regional level. I think one of the reasons why we see some of the changes that we see after 1918 influenza is not only increases in technology and whatnot, but because that pandemic also happened during the end of the First World War. And so with that, politically, nations come together. We get the creation of the United Nations as a result of that. And it's from the United Nations that we later on get eventually the World Health Organization. So, about 30 years prior to that pandemic, with the 1889 pandemic, I don't think we saw such a great extent of coordination and organization. It's still very much in the early days, but certainly there was a recognition amongst at least regional governments and maybe even country nation governments that we need to be better organized with how we're keeping records. We, these are the sorts of things that we should be tracking. I can say that one impact that is a good thing as a result of the 1889 pandemic was some cities, Hamilton, Ontario being an excellent example, some cities realized we've really got to do something with the fact that our populations are increasing and our city is growing, and our wastewater and sanitation infrastructure is not adequate for that. So in Hamilton, we know specifically that during that pandemic, and this is actually related to people's belief that the disease might be caused by miasma or bad air, but and air emanating from sewage, right? So it prompted the city to make an investment in opening up new cesspools and putting them away from places where people are getting drinking water, and to increase the use of ceramic toilets, because a lot of the toilets at that time were actually made out of, the seats were made out of wood. And people thought, oh, wood is a porous material, and so there might be these little miasmas like soaking into the wood, and then you touch it when you sit on it. And that's not actually how that disease spreads. But the impact, improving sanitation systems, is a good thing for health overall. And
couldn't agree more.
It was driven by people's fears of that disease, even though their understanding of what caused it was not correct.
But one thing which is quite surprising, officially this disease lasted from 1889 to 1892. A couple of weeks ago, I started moderating some interviews about the tobacco mosaic virus. The tobacco mosaic virus had been discovered by a Russian biologist, Dmitry Ivanovsky, 1892. And I interviewed Professor Angela Krager, Professor Sankaran, Professor George Lomonosov from INES. So, but I was quite surprised what determined scientists. I mean, it's the ever first discovered virus in this world is the tobacco mosaic virus. And honestly, I've spoken to so many physicians nowadays. I said, have you ever heard about the tobacco mosaic virus? No. I say, yeah, but it's like the first virus ever discovered. And one of the questions which I asked Professor Lomonosov was like, well, I mean, were there no other preferences or priorities 1892 than to look at plant viruses? So, well, I mean, this is science. So the first virus got discovered 1892. But this tobacco mosaic virus was like the first virus ever discovered in this world in the middle of a huge worldwide pandemic. Have you ever heard that, let's say, some scientists or people spreading conspiracy theories back then have ever linked this pandemic to the tobacco mosaic virus?
I have not heard that actually, but I also don't know that much about that virus either.
No worries, me neither.
But no, in the records that we've looked at, I've never heard that virus mentioned. What that could be is just an artifact of the fact that sometimes scientists and academics work in bubbles. And even though that was discovered that year, maybe nobody else knew about it. Maybe just like a small group of people knew about it, and it wasn't really getting out there into public knowledge.
Yeah. The amazing part is I started preparing myself. I don't hold a PhD in economics, but I had to prepare myself for all the interviews related to the tobacco mosaic virus. And I found papers about scientific papers, how the tobacco mosaic virus, although it does not replicate in humans, so it says it does not replicate, it does not infect. Nevertheless, it has an impact on our immunity. And I saw such papers going back to the 20s. Now, surprisingly, there's a paper how the tobacco mosaic virus is inducing autophagy and stress in the endoplasmatic reticulum in hair cells. And that's a paper published by the Wuhan Medical Institute, I think the Faculty of Medicine, 2012. And in this paper, ladies and gentlemen, and dear Sally, this paper is very suggestive. They write about the potential of a co-infection, how the tobacco mosaic virus is actually inducing this autophagy, and that on the membrane of these autophagosomes, basically coronaviruses, polioviruses, and hepatitis viruses replicate. And I said, this is quite an interesting topic, and I then decided in future to have interviews with neurologists and immunologists to look at this absolutely fascinating virus, which seems like a multi-talent. It can convert metal salt precursors into gold. It can improve energy systems in boiling water. It can alter the cell death. It knows so many things. And I'd like personally to find out what is the connection between this virus and COVID, and encourage, ladies and gentlemen, all of you to do your research. Stay tuned with Compass. It's an absolute fascinating topic, because this virus it also has what I read, and that was like beyond madness. It has lytic properties. So we all know that you can kill a bacteria with antibiotics. Mm-hmm. The other way is with bacteriophages. No, the tobacco mosaic virus has lytic properties, which either stimulates replication of bacteria or inhibits the replication of bacteria. So it's like a tuning system of evolution. The question is, how does it get into our lungs? Because Chinese scientists found in the lungs of COVID patients also the tobacco mosaic virus. Ladies and gentlemen, it does not get via smoking. Sally, yeah. I hope it was a bit of impulse maybe to write a second edition on the Russian flu. Thank you very much for having joined us here today on Compass at Quotidiano TV. Wishing you a nice Sunday today in Anchorage, and all the best.
Yes, thank you so much for the opportunity. It was a lot of fun.
It was my pleasure. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.